Hey guys, and welcome back to Just Ask Jason. Before we get started today, I just want to remind you to please like, share, subscribe, all that sorts of stuff. Sharing this video on Facebook or subscribing to us if you haven't already or anything like that really helps increase our online footprint, which means more people like you get to see these videos and hopefully be ministered to by our church here at Berean. So if you could do that, it's immensely helpful to us as a church. It's helpful to me as a pastor, and it's super, super helpful to anyone who ends up seeing these videos. So thank you if you've already done that, and please do if you haven't already. Now, today, we're going to be talking about Christians and the government and how that relationship kind of works, what the Bible says about that relationship, and specifically what our responsibilities as Christians are towards the government. How should we interact with it? And I think this is really, really pertinent for a couple of reasons. First of all, because there's been some major historical events going on over the last few weeks, specifically around the Capitol. I don't need to expand on that anymore for you guys to kind of know what's going on there. And also because in just over a week, we're going to have a change in administration, which is a very significant time in our country's political cycle. So it's a good time for us to stop and say, okay, how do Christians interact with government? What does the Bible say we should do? What does the Bible say we shouldn't do? So let's get started. So right off the bat here, let's talk about obedience and taxes. Romans 13, 1 through 7 says this: "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whomever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive the ruler's approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is a servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjugation, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this you will pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, and honor to whom honor is owed." Jesus says a very similar thing in Mark 12:17. He says, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's." In other words, pay your tithes and your taxes. Now, this is a very sticky passage for a couple of reasons. For example, how can a government be a servant of God or a minister of God if that particular government persecutes, imprisons, maybe even kills Christians? How is that okay? We see plenty of governments, even the good governments, occasionally do very immoral things to their people or to immigrants or to refugees or whatever. So how can we say that governments are servants of God when they do evil things? Well, we have to understand that Paul is speaking in a somewhat limited context here. Now, there's plenty of different discussions and arguments you can go from here, but I think the simplest way to understand this is Paul is discussing the government as something that can only exist if God allows it to exist. So if a particular government exists, whether it's the U.S. or North Korea or any other country on the face of the earth, it must exist with God's permission. We may not know why. It may seem very strange to us, but God has a reason for allowing that government to exist. So there's a certain level of faith or trust we need. The other thing is that Paul is specifically drawing attention to the government's responsibility to punish wrongdoers. And he's saying that this is a ministry. This is a thing that God wants the government to do. He wants the government to punish wrongdoers. Does that mean they do it incorrectly sometimes? Yeah, of course. Every government to ever exist has managed to convict someone who is innocent or to let someone who is guilty walk free or to have a law that was unjust on their books or something like that. But if the government's not going to do it, who is? So we see Paul kind of drawing attention to the government as not an entirely good thing, not something that is infallible, but just something which God allows to exist and wants to exist because it can work good in the world. And that applies to any government of any country. So what's the result? Well, we should obey the government because God wants that government to exist. Now, there is two acknowledgments we need to make here. The first one's cultural. The second one is like a strictly biblical command-oriented thing. The first one is when Paul's writing, he's writing to people that live in a monarchy, in an autocracy, where there's one dude at the top, we call him the Roman emperor, that has all the authority. So the common person like you and me couldn't just go to the emperor and be like, hey, we're going to vote you out of office. You better shape up and do the right thing. Like, they couldn't do that. They would have gotten executed. So Paul doesn't talk about voting or talk about petitioning or anything because those things didn't exist in the Roman world. So Christians, I think, should vote and should be civically involved, at least to some degree, but we balance that with obedience. If the government makes an action, even if we disagree with it, if it doesn't violate God's law, we go with it. Even if we voted against it, even if we petitioned against it, we still have to submit to the government. Now, the second acknowledgement we should put in here, and that is, if the government asks you to violate God's law, you say no. This is an example we see over and over and over and over again in Scripture. We'll get on that a little bit more later, but just for some examples, Daniel in Babylon, his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in Babylon, Paul as well, and if you believe church tradition, then even Peter, well, for that matter, Peter and John both, because they're imprisoned and one of them is executed at different points throughout early church history. So we see Christians, well, behaving badly and breaking the law because the government told them, hey, it's illegal for you to do what you're supposed to do as a Christian. We'll touch on that in just a few minutes. One of my favorite stories is something I can't read Romans 13 without thinking of, was when I went to a church somewhere in rural Missouri, and I wish I could remember the name of it, but it's been a few years, and I don't remember the name of the church specifically. But it was a little tiny church. I pulled up. They had very pretty stained glass on the outside. And I come in, and I talk to the people there, and it was immediately very apparent this was an extremely, extremely conservative church. And I don't mean that religiously. I mean like politically an extremely conservative church. And I am not an extremely conservative person. I'm kind of more of a centrist. And so I was kind of sitting here like kind of guarding my words, like worried that I might say something that would upset someone that isn't like relevant to the scriptures that we were talking about. And so I just kind of like kept my mouth shut for a lot of conversation and just, existed. We started talking, of course, about Romans 13, which is all about obeying the government. And someone brought up to the Sunday school teacher, they're like, well, what happens if the government tries to take my guns away? And I kind of froze because I'm like, oh man, like this is going to be a very like hot topic issue, right? And it was like a lot of people around the room were immediately really upset, and they're kind of like murmuring, that like when people are upset and they're in a big group and they're kind of like, and you just hear that noise in the background. Like it was like that. And I was just like, oh man, I hope this doesn't like turn into a big argument or doesn't turn into a bunch of people just ranting about how much they dislike the government or whatever. And it didn't. Because they sat there and like, well, let's just read this again. And they read it again. They started talking about individual phrases that Paul uses. And what they ended up saying, and this has really stuck with me, because it's a bunch of very conservative people, very concerned about their Second Amendment rights. And they stopped. And the Bible teacher looked at this person who had brought the question up and goes, so what do you think we should do if the government does try to take our guns away? And the guy stopped and said, well, I don't like it. But I guess Paul's saying I'd have to give my guns up. And like, I don't know if his application is 110% accurate, but the heart behind what he was saying really impressed me. Because this is something that really mattered to him, that he really wanted to be like, no one will ever take away my firearms. But he's reading Romans 13 and he's saying it's more important to me to be a good Christian than to like assert my rights. And that's really cool. Like that heart behind that statement is extremely, extremely impressive to me. And I think as long as we approach issues in our culture with that heart of, well, I'm going to assert my Christianity before I try to assert my personal rights or my preferences or my political ideologies, we're probably on the right path. We might not always be 100% correct, but we're going to be heading in the right direction. Now, there's some other issues that we want to touch on today. One is, when should we disobey? When should we disobey government law? And I would say, just because I assume everyone watching this is in the United States, at this point, probably never. At this point in history, probably never. And that is because the only real examples we see of Christians disobeying the law is when the law either stops them from evangelizing or forces them to worship an idol. And in the first case with evangelism, they kind of seem to pick their spots. Let me go into more detail about that. In the case of being forbidden to preach or evangelize, if you read the story of Paul in Acts, then you'll see sometimes like in Ephesus when he gets kicked out after a big riot in Ephesus where the crowd's shouting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians," for like 12 hours, and then they try to like beat him to death or something, and he gets kicked out of the city. He actually leaves. Like he willingly leaves rather than breaking the law. But in other cases where he knows he's going to be arrested, where he knows he's going to be violating some laws, he actually decides to keep preaching anyways. So it seems to be there's a little bit of wisdom needed in whether you should walk away or whether it is beneficial to the kingdom for you to actually disobey in that case. But that is specifically dealing with evangelism, with preaching the gospel. Another case that we see where we never see Christians obey the law is when they're required to worship a god other than Yahweh. So we see this like in Revelation, for example. There's a lot of discussion around emperor worship in the book of Revelation, and John has this unequivocal answer of you do not worship idols. You do not worship the emperor. You worship Yahweh and no one else. So in that case, we can say confidently, if there were ever a law that required you to worship someone other than Yahweh, the God of Israel, you don't do it. Like there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. You just don't do it. So in those cases, we should disobey, but those aren't really relevant in the U.S., not right now anyway. So right now, I'd say, well, we just don't. You might not be happy with the government, but Paul's words in Romans 13 seem to ring true. You pay honor where honor is due, money where money is due, and you respect and follow the government's rules. Another issue as far as our relationship to the government that comes up sometimes is military service. And I've always been kind of confused why this comes up because the Bible just doesn't really talk about it. And so I tend to assume if the Bible doesn't say anything, then it's probably left up to our judgment. The few examples we have where military service is at all relevant to Christianity in the New Testament is Acts 10, where Cornelius is mentioned as a centurion and a God-fearing man who converts in that chapter to Christianity. And in Philippians 1:13, where Paul mentions that the entire palace guard, which is a historical group of soldiers known as the Praetorian Guard, where he mentions some of the Praetorians are coming to know Jesus. So it seems from these passages, because there's no mention of them like having to become pacifists or quit the military or anything, it seems perfectly fine for Christians to be members of the military. The one kind of addendum I would make to that is if military service is compulsory in a country, just me personally, I would lean towards saying that, yeah, you should serve in the military in that case as a Christian because it is law. And what does Romans 13 say? Romans 13 says you should obey your government. So for example, if like a Christian were living in Israel and military service is compulsory in Israel, then, well, they should serve in the Israeli military because that's what the government says they should do. Does that make sense? I hope so. Now, this is the thing that I really wanted to get to today. Let's talk about the danger of idol worship. I just want to read a little section out of Revelations 13. It says, "The dragon stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea, and it had 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 crowns on its horns, and on each head was a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear, and a mouth like that of a lion. The dragon gave the beast his power and his throne and great authority. And one of these heads, the beast seemed to have a fatal wound, but that fatal wound had been healed. The whole world was filled with wonder and followed the beast. The people worshipped the dragon because he had given authority to the beast. They also worshipped the beast and asked, 'Who is like this beast? Who can wage war against it?'" So here we have a heavily symbolic passage, and I've talked a little bit about how to interpret Revelation in the past. You have to understand most of the book, after you get past the letters part, is just full of symbols. And you have to understand the culture. You have to understand what's called apocalyptic literature. It's a type of genre of writing, which I've talked about a little bit in the past. And you have to understand your Old Testament. If you understand those three things, the culture, apocalyptic writing, and the Old Testament, you're probably on the right path. Now, elsewhere in Revelation, in surrounding chapters where this dragon is, or this beast is described, then we are told that each of its heads is one of 7 hills. Each of its heads is one of 7 hills. That's a significant detail. We're also told point blank several chapters earlier that this dragon that's mentioned at the beginning and at the end is Satan. So we know the dragon is Satan, and this beast is something that's obeying him, and its heads represent 7 hills. There's other images that are pertinent in this passage. Horns and crowns usually are prophetic symbols that represent political power and military power. So we're dealing probably with something political, something military. The beast having a fatal wound that had been healed was a popular phrase that was used to describe Rome, because Rome had actually gone through an intense era of decline where it had a lot of bad leaders in a row, and then it kind of bottomed out and kind of went back up on the upswing because they had a number of later good emperors that had kind of brought them back to prominence. So they looked kind of weak for a while, but then they were gaining strength again. So it is as though Rome had suffered a fatal wound and then miraculously healed from it. And so that's kind of a poetic way that Rome was sometimes described. And those 7 hills that we mentioned earlier, well, Rome is known as the city on 7 hills. Why? Because, well, there's 7 major hills around the core area of Rome. So what we're getting here probably is John painting a picture of Rome. He's describing Rome as a beast that's being manipulated by Satan, which is a pretty harsh critique. But I really want to look at that last verse there. Verse 4, it says, people worshipped the dragon because he had been given authority by the beast. They also worshipped the beast, or because he had given authority to the beast, and they also worshipped the beast and asked who is like the beast and who can wage war against it. So what we have here is a picture in verse 4 of people worshiping the nation of Rome, the empire of Rome, saying no one can wage war against it, no one is greater than it. And John is trying to make a very pertinent point to his audience. Because remember, his audience, they're being persecuted, they're tempted to leave Christianity behind, and they're being pressured by the government to literally worship the emperor by burning a pinch of incense as an offering to him, to acknowledge him as being blessed by the gods, to acknowledge him as the Lord of their lives, when in reality, Jesus should be the only Lord of their lives. And John is warning them in this passage and beyond that it is a sin for them to worship the nation of Rome, for them to put Rome's good above God's desires for their lives. So we obey the government. We get that from Romans 13. But in Revelation 13, we're warned you obey the government, but you don't worship it. And you certainly don't worship a political figurehead like the emperor. Now, I bring this up because we got to apply this to our lives today. We can't just leave it in the past. It's not just an issue of, oh, well, we aren't burning a pinch of incense. We can worship political figures and parties in other ways. And we have seen that. We've seen that play out in our nation on both sides of the political spectrum over the last year. We've seen protests devolve into riots. We saw it just a couple weeks ago. And that is entirely unacceptable to the Christian, because you aren't worshiping Trump, and you aren't worshiping Biden, and you aren't worshiping the Black Lives Matters movement, and you aren't worshiping whatever right-wing movements are going on that led to the protests in the Capitol. You aren't worshiping those things. You're worshiping Jesus. And you're allowed to have your political preferences and you're allowed to have your civic concerns, but your primary concern is Jesus and introducing others to him, and everything else is secondary at best. Now, how can you tell if you're part of a movement that has gone too far? There's a couple of passages that are relevant, but really the core comes down to this. It's all about love. Matthew 22:36 through 40. Someone comes up to Jesus and says, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" And Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments." John 13:34 through 35, or 13, verse 34 through 35 says this. Jesus speaking to his followers, "A new commandment I give to you. Love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." So how do you know if something that you are participating in isn't Christian? If something that you're about to post, something you're about to say, somewhere you're about to go, something you're about to do is not something you should be doing? You ask the question, is what I'm doing, saying, or posting loving? Is it helpful? Does it challenge, build up, or comfort people? If the answer is no, then don't do it. Now, that does mean some of the times you're going to say things that are going to upset people, that they're going to stir the pot a little bit. I personally am not particularly afraid of doing that. But you should always ask if by upsetting someone, if you're actually going to be serving them, loving them, helping them to learn more, to grow closer to Jesus, to have a freer and better life. If the answer to that is no, if you are not helping someone in some way, just don't do it. If there's even a doubt in your mind, just don't do it. It's not worth it. To make things a little bit more practical and a little bit more applicable to recent events, if someone is dragging across towards a building and chucking rocks through the windows, you probably shouldn't be there. If there is some sort of protest going on, even a protest for a good cause, but you see an entire main street of a town board up windows and police show up because they're afraid that things are going to get burnt down, you probably shouldn't be there. And as soon as you see flames going up into the night sky, you should leave. Because Christians cannot participate in that sort of behavior. It ruins our witness. How can we look at the world and say that God offers peace and that God teaches you to love your enemies when we're burning down their businesses or breaking into the Capitol building? That's horrible. And we shouldn't be participating, and we certainly shouldn't be condoning it. Several months ago, I made a video all about what white Christians need to know about the protests. And so some of you might be surprised now that I'm sitting here and I'm saying that rioting isn't okay. Well, actually, in that video, I said the same thing. I said Christians cannot condone rioting. If we're going to love our neighbors, we might need to understand why they're so angry, even when it's difficult for us to understand. But we should never participate in violence or condone it, regardless of what the purpose behind it was. We just can't do that, guys. So let's be better. Let's be a little bit more like Jesus expected us to be. Let's love our neighbors and love our enemies and refuse to lower ourselves to the standards of the world. Refuse to participate in rioting and violence. Refuse to condone it and refuse to promote it. We can do better than that. I really believe that we can.